Thanks to all the presenters so far. So we're jumping straight from Peter's underappreciated taxa straight into probably the headline predators, our top water predators, and the different roles that they can play in rewilding. So we're, for the sake of this discussion, really focusing on our larger mammalian predators, specifically dingoes, quolls, and introduced cats and foxes. I'm really excited just to get straight in. So we'll tuck into some questions and then hopefully have some time for some audience questions and discussion before lunch. Kelly, we're going to start with you. Hopefully, pass that one down. Kelly, could you tell us a bit, as briefly as is possible for such a big question, about the history of dingoes in Australia? What do we know about when and how they arrived, the ecological roles they fill, and obviously their cultural importance as well?
So do I press the button?
You're right, you're good.
Okay, so, well, first of all, can I just acknowledge that I just want to pay my respects to the Jara people, their ancestors, their elders, and I give thanks for being here today, so, and their spirit of country as well, so thank you for that. Yeah, that was a three-part question, so I'm going to kind of tackle it bit by bit, if that's okay. I usually prefer yarning circles, so I'm going to pretend this is one big yarning circle, just to feel a bit more comfortable, because I'm quite nervous. So, okay, so what we see, or what we can tell from the archaeological record, is that dingo had arrived here by the land bridge around about 3,300 years ago. However, genetics have played a big role through the research of Dr. Kylie Counts, through the University of New South Wales, who have research saying that dingoes were here between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. But as a First Nations perspective, different mobs would have stories of how dingo came or when they came, but rather also holding on to the belief that they have always been here, just as we have. So that's that. Next question.
Yeah. Any comments, I guess, to add to that, to the very large ecological role that the dingoes play in our ecosystem?
Yeah, so look, the ecological role is undeniably really there. I can't even say it, you know what I'm trying to say. Basically, they are the boss of country. They are the balancer, the apex predator. They keep everything in line. But from a cultural perspective, they are not just, the apex predators as looking through an ecological lens, but a cultural lens. They are kin, they are family. They, together with mob, symbiotically, they look after country, they heal people. So the relationship goes far beyond just ecology, but rather is a cultural relationship and connection to country and people.
Great, thank you. Damien, how about quolls? What can you tell us, I guess, as a bit of a rundown, broad overview on their ecology, distributions? For everyone in the audience who might not be that familiar with quolls, what are they? What do they do?
Sure, well, the easiest way is to show. So there's 6 species of quolls. They all have spots. Their colours range from a blondish colour to an almost black colour. When I'm talking about quolls, I'm mostly talking about eastern quolls. This is actually a pretty good analogue of an eastern quoll in terms of size, although this one has been in the good paddock. And it's also notable because it's not trying to bite me. So they are, if the dingo is the boss, perhaps the quoll is the mini boss. It's a carnivore, it's nocturnal, it actively hunts, it will consume anything it can catch, and it functions as an apex predator. Sorry, I should mention too, it's marsupial, not the central mammal. Where else would I go with that? So they live in the wild 2 to 4 years maybe, in captivity about 7 years. The female, when she gives birth, will give birth to as many as 30 young. They're grain of rice size. She only has 6 to 8 nipples, so it's straight away survival of the fittest for the eastern quoll. What have I left out here? Range. If you look at historic documents, pre-European settlement, it's suspected that they were hugely abundant in southeastern Australia, particularly the eastern quoll. They're not anymore, and we'll talk more about that later, but that's where they were very abundant if you look at newspaper stories and articles from the 1800s. Eastern quoll is extinct in the wild in Victoria now, which is why we're talking about it today and why we deal with it at Mount Rothwell.
Great, thank you. And Bron, we all hear about the impacts that cats and foxes have on our native wildlife. Can you take us back 250 years and how and why did these species make it to Australia and why have they established so successfully?
Yeah, good question. Thanks so much, everybody. So I think if we go back pre-European invasion, we had a country where across mainland Australia there were dingoes, there were quolls, there were also a lot of raptors and the big lizards, the verandas. And then down in Tasmania you had the thylacines and the Tasmanian devils as well. And then the first invading ships brought with them cats, both as companion animals and for pest control. And from those very first ships, cats became established in the mainland of Australia and spread very rapidly, so that by 70 years later you had feral cats right across Australia, including Tasmania and many of the offshore islands. Foxes took a little bit more effort. So people started bringing them here in the 1840s and the 1850s, didn't manage to successfully establish them until the 1870s after some concerted, repeated effort. And then they absolutely took off as well. So they spread rapidly northwards from Victoria up right until the sort of through into the subtropics over the following 50 years or so. And the densities, so now we have a situation where we have foxes and cats across most of mainland Australia and cats only in Tasmania, thank goodness. And the densities vary greatly, so between sort of 0.1 of an animal and maybe more than 5 animals per square kilometre.
Kelly, why have dingoes declined across so much of Australia? What are the drivers of that and what effects flow on from that?
Okay, so I'm going to speak to what I know in terms of Victoria, and lethal control plays a big role in that. Poisoning, the use of 1080, shooting, fencing, the loss of country due to urbanisation as well, but also the lack of physical relationship between dingo and First Nations people. Although dingo is still very present in the spiritual and cultural within country, we do lack a bit of the physical relationship, and so that's why it's so important that we try our best to reconnect, reawaken that relationship with the physical, so bringing them back into country somehow. But I guess the stabilisation of country has been altered, and that I guess plays a very big role as to why dingoes, in particularly Victoria, are not as abundant.
And pretty much the same question to you, Damien, around quolls. Why have they declined so severely across most of Australia and across all their species and the flow impacts of that?
Well, it's the usual suspects. Fragmentation of habitat, total loss of habitat, predation by introduced predators. But in particular for quolls, and it's persecution by humans. I recently came across one, preparing for this, I came across a paper where during the attempts to introduce European rabbits to Australia, it was believed that quolls were holding back the introduction of rabbits. And a bounty was put on them. And I don't know the numbers, but the bounty ran out of money because so many people were bringing in quoll skins. Along with the belief, of course, that quolls will predate on stock, which they most likely do. It's our persecution that has taken them out of the landscape, basically. It's fascinating that the drive that we had as European settlers to introduce rabbits here, we actively eliminated the predator that was holding us back.
On the topic of predators, holding us back. Ron, can you touch on some of the data around the impacts of cats and foxes on our native fauna and how they are really holding back recovery of a lot of our threatened species?
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. They're incredibly well adapted, diverse, generalist predators. Collectively, they think that foxes and cats probably kill 2 billion native animals a year, and they prey on hundreds of different mammal species as well as reptiles and birds. It's important to remember that killing individuals is not equivalent to an impact on the population. However, it's a good analogy to think of how many sheep are killed by Australians every year, and the sheep populations are doing just fine. But the evidence around fox and cat negative impacts is pretty damning, both to do with the declines of native species that followed the wave of invasion of foxes and cats across the country, the success of native species in islands where they've been eradicated and fenced areas where the numbers have either been reduced to very low levels or eradicated, and the challenges with reintroducing lost native species to landscapes where foxes and cats are still abundant.
Yeah, thanks. So we've sort of touched a little bit on human-wildlife conflict already in some of these answers so far. Starting with you, Kelly, around dingoes, how do we address this? It's obviously going to be an issue in agricultural landscapes and even tourist areas where dingoes become really accustomed to people and attacks happen and they get very well publicised, unfortunately. How do we address this and how do we sort of convince people that these animals are important in the landscape?
Well, I think first and foremost, listening to First Nations people on how their view on dingoes, what dingoes mean culturally. They may have insights on how to bring back dingoes into country in a way that could be, I guess, balanced. I guess an example of this is in the work that we've done at Wadawurrung through the Dingo Declaration and how we want to put forward our feelings on protection and bringing dingo back to country. We could start something so small as having a pair of dingoes that we can connect with physically to restore that physical relationship with, and perhaps go from there. But I guess I've lost track of your question. I'm sorry. Could you bring me back to what you were just breaking it down into like one simple question for me, because I'll go all over the place.
Yeah, largely, how do we address the human mindset around the human-dingo sort of conflict that is present?
Yeah, so again, I think I was right the first time. Yeah, listening to Mob, educating ourselves more, like going beyond stigma that's already out there in terms of the media on what they're saying about Kagari, and because they're only showing certain snapshots, they're not actually going into the context of the situation. Dingoes are naturally very timid and scared. I know, I have one. He's like a son to me, and so what's going on in Kagari is they're so used to human contact, they don't have that fear factor anymore. In fact, people have fed them and all that stuff. So that's a very unique situation compared to what is typical in other areas where there are dingoes. They'd rather stay away from people as opposed to going and trying to attack people. So, I think bringing it back to talking with Mob and really walking together to having a deeper understanding of dingo in general, cultural and ecological as well.
Great, thanks. And Damien, again, how do we balance the concerns of chicken farmers, for example, with the benefits of having quolls across the landscape?
Right, so try not to use my grumpy voice. We're putting, especially where I'm no, we're putting native species behind fences to protect them. So do that with your chickens. And honestly, using chickens as an example is a good one because there's already plenty of cats and foxes in the environment predating your chickens. So you'll need to be protecting the chickens from those. So there's no difference to protecting them from quolls and protecting them from cats and foxes. So that's my grumpy engineer response. We can do the ecology response, but I don't need to convince anybody in here, but I like to come up with sound bites like put a fence around your chickens as a way of getting a conversation started with lay people who will say, quolls are going to be an impact on my chickens. It's like, well, you've already got foxes and cats impacting your chickens, so what's the difference? So I hope that came across correctly.
Yeah, perfect. And moving on from that, Ron, we know how complex our ecosystems are. Can you touch a bit on interactions between predators that we're talking about, and in particular cats and foxes, and how they sort of impact one another when they coexist or when one is missing from the area?
Yeah, you're right, they are really complex. And sometimes I have situations where people put out camera traps and they find a really healthy population of bandicoots and potoroos and cats and foxes, and they're like, oh my god, I've got to deal with the cats and foxes. And you're like, do you? Because you've got a really healthy population of bandicoots and potoroos. You've got to think about when you pull one piece out of the system, how it shifts. And from new studies, we're finding that the relative density of cats and foxes varies greatly between, say, the wet forests of the operating ranges, where there's heaps of cats, not many foxes, into more agricultural or arid landscapes where you might have a one-to-one balance. And when you take foxes, because they're easier to control out of the system, you do see shifts in cat populations in some contexts. So you might get an increase in cat density. Simply, I think, no, okay. And that may be simply because the foxes aren't competing for the same food source, as well as perhaps foxes are dominant in some contexts. So you get increases in cat density, you'll get shifting of the times of day cats are active, and that will change which species, native species, are vulnerable to them. But in other contexts, foxes may not be the limiting factor on the cat population. If you're in a really arid zone, water may be the limiting factor, and so removing foxes may have precisely zero effect. In other contexts where the habitat is really complex, like down in those wet forests, the foxes are struggling already, and the cats have a lot of different habitat to escape from the foxes in. So again, removing foxes may have a much smaller impact than in a sort of more temperate landscape. So yeah, it's complex, but it's worth thinking about for sure.
Good hands, basically.
I know, it's a science podcast, isn't it?
So I guess some more optimistic sort of viewpoints on things. Damien, what works with quoll conservation? What do we know works, and what do we still learn?
Well, there's lots to learn, of course. What we do know is that they breed quite readily in captivity. Well, the eastern quolls do at least. They are generally, well, not generally, they are solitary animals, except when it comes to breeding time. And how we do this at Mount Rothwell is we have them in adjoining pens when it's breeding season, which was about a month ago. We open a little door between the male and the female's enclosures. Eventually they start talking to each other, and eventually they will mate. And when it's quite pretty and beautiful, when they actually do mate, they then sleep in nests together for several weeks until they're sure that the female is pregnant, and then they go to separate ways. So what works is they do breed well in captivity. Now that paper I mentioned earlier about quolls holding back rabbits, that does generate a bit of noise about people wanting to introduce quolls to rabbit-infested environments to control rabbits. Doesn't work. Is the short answer. We have rabbits at Mount Rothwell, and we also have eastern quolls loose in the sanctuary, and we've got plenty of rabbits. The quolls breed at a much slower rate than the rabbits. Perhaps they could suppress an emerging rabbit population or a very low-density rabbit population, but they're not going to suppress a major rabbit infestation. What else do we not know? Look, the list is long. In reintroducing them to the wild in the presence of cats and foxes, we don't know exactly how they're going to react. They are extinct in Victoria. We don't know what would happen if we put them back in the environment. That's an area of ongoing research at the moment, and I'll talk about this later today. At the moment, we're putting them into heavily managed sanctuaries, be it an island or a fenced sanctuary. So there's still a lot to know.
Thanks. Kelly, can you tell us about any initiatives being led by traditional owners in Victoria or elsewhere in Australia to either protect or re-establish dingo populations?
Yeah, so from my work at Wairarong, we have contributed to putting forward a declaration, and that was talking about our cultural connection, why we wanted them protected, why we want them back onto country, and basically it was an avenue for us to really state our stance on dingoes and how culturally and spiritually they're important to us. So there's that bit, and that is being used to inform DECA, state government, in terms of potentially drawing up a strategic plan for dingoes, but also more within our own traditional owner group that will lead to our own dingo strategy as well. Wairarong had contributed to the revision of the Wildlife Act of 1975, and we put forward a case study there which suggested that we wanted dingo not only to be protected via the Wildlife Act, but rather to be looked at as living cultural heritage. So there's that, and I guess Jara, if they have actually, I can't speak culturally, it's culturally inappropriate for me to sort of talk about what they're doing, but in the public realm, they have a document out there which people can look at, and that's their Healthy Country Plan, and that also talks about their views and potential strategies on the reintroduction or restoring the spirit of dingo back into country.
Thanks. Ron, control is obviously, kind of the key tool we've got to manage introduced predators outside of fenced reserves. What works? Are there any sort of great sort of success stories or surprises in that field?
Yeah, it's tricky. We've seen some really effective control programs, particularly in areas where you can limit immigration back into the area. But we have also got big-scale fox control programs in open landscapes, and it requires you to manage across a big area, intensively and ongoing, because foxes and cats are incredibly good at reproducing, and they can move really long distances. So once you commit to a predator control program, you are committed ongoing into the future until someone comes up with a better solution than the tools we have at the moment. In terms of broad-scale control, baiting, particularly aerial baiting, as Derek mentioned, does achieve the greatest population knockdown with the lowest amount of resources. Aerial baiting is virtually irrelevant in Victoria because of other regulations and concerns about bycatch. You have a bunch of supplementary tools as well to do trapping and shooting, but very few, and felixes for cats. But they are supplementary and they're not going to achieve that population knockdown. So, yeah.
I guess on that, are there any particular emerging technologies or control methods that you're particularly optimistic about or that are showing great promise? Or is this stuff sort of still quite a long way down the pipeline?
I think it's still emerging, unfortunately. Yeah, I think there's no silver bullet. We've obviously, if we had some magic method of getting rid of foxes and feral cats, we'd be using it. We're not there yet. But there are programs that are having real success. If you go over to Glenelg in southwestern Victoria and you want to find a bandicoot or a pondaroo, you need to go looking in the places with the control program where they've been doing baiting for 15, 20 years, not the places where they don't. So it does have some success stories, but there's complications and challenges.
Yeah, great. And I guess along those lines, for our central Victorian community, like what options are out there? What can people do today to start, whether it's driving policy or anything like that, to start dealing with this problem sort of in our landscape?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think you want to be very clear about the outcome you're aiming to achieve, because you're not aiming to kill foxes or cats. you're aiming to protect something or reintroduce something or whatever. And so you need to think about evidence of harm and evidence of achieving what you're trying to achieve and the most efficient way of getting there. And that you are talking large scale and long-term duration if you're talking about managing open populations of foxes and cats. You can also think about some alternative things to do with habitat structure, particularly preventing phytophthora getting into your landscapes, keeping that dense, complex understory that is providing shelter for our native species, helping them escape predation. Thinking about times and places in specific times where they might be most vulnerable. Is that after a drought? Is that after a burn goes through the landscape? And then there's stuff that we can all do, which is to do with keeping your pet cat inside. Feral cats is not friendly. and not feeding foxes. So I did a PhD where I tracked foxes around the landscape up in the forest of the old ways. And the damn foxes kept leaving the forest and going down to the farmlands of the towns. And I'm like, I want to study forest foxes. And I couldn't find any. Well, I found some eventually. But most of them were moving between the forests and the towns and the farmlands. And they were going down to the carcass stops, to the school playgrounds, to the scrap pits behind the pizza shop and the fish and chip shop. And they were getting food. And so you're getting a much higher density of foxes in the margins of your forest where they can commute back and forwards and get benefits from the resources we leave lying around for them. So that's another thing to think about in terms of trying to just reduce the amount of food we're providing for them. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Kelly, do you have sort of final question? Any thoughts on, I guess, a call to action why the Central Victorian community should support having dingoes in our landscape? And I don't know if you have any particular ideas of where might be most suitable or most achievable for that sort of thing to happen.
So where is, again, Jarrah country, not my country, I won't even go there. They've probably got their own plans and their own vision. So, but Wadawurrung country, we don't have native title as yet. And so we have a small property in Balan, but we work closely with you in different areas. So we're hoping to just start, I guess, renewing that physical connection with dingo, and it might be as small as having 2 dingoes on that property. So community can just deepen the connection, understand more, but just, it's like reawakening that connection up. So that's where there are talks about that, potentially. So that's the scope that I'm working in. This is gone. Shut me out. The call for action is, I think, first and foremost, it's not about like what I want. It's about, or it's about what I guess mob wants. I'm going to talk with my mob hat on. So it's listening again to First Nations peoples and perspectives. It's walking in true partnership. We're not just talking about consultation, we're talking about true and meaningful collaboration from the beginning when we're talking about revegetation, biodiversity in general, working with other partners and stakeholders, and really truly walking together, and we say Kori Waranich, which means walking together collectively. So the call for action, it shouldn't just be reliant upon First Nations people. I know there's an organisation out there called Landholders for Dingoes, and they have some stories up where these stations, like Woolen Station and Noongar Station, so Woolen Station in WA and Noongar Station in Queensland, where farmers have actually allowed dingoes to be on their properties to help, control the kangaroo population for their grazing. So I really don't have the answer. I'm just out there trying to help mob and help Wadawurrung people and us to bring dingo back in whatever way we can, and that is meaningful to us, and supporting our other neighbours in doing that as well.
Great, thank you. And thanks all three of you for your great insights into this topic. I think we've got a bit of time for questions now, so we'll jump straight into that from the audience.
Thanks. Great talk again, great panel. Quick question, and I think because it wasn't really, we were sort of going there, we didn't quite get there, with regards to when reducing predators across the landscape requires landscape approach. It's really difficult. A lot of what we heard this morning is really about trying to get down to low numbers. In your experience as panellists and in your work, what is the tolerable range or level that enables, is there evidence, I suppose, of predator interactions where the survival rate goes up, or there's an improvement in the population because of predator exposure? I've got lots of other questions, but I'm going to start with that one because that's what I'm just really want to know, like, because it speaks to the potential of populations to survive long term if they can develop strategies or behaviours that make them less likely to be preyed upon. Or, yeah.
Do you want to jump in? Yeah.
It's a really important question that we wish we knew the answer to. We have a very poor grasp just on what baseline densities of foxes and cats are in different environments, and we're working to get better at doing that. And the relationship between density and impact is not always one-to-one. So we do know that in some landscapes you can have a problem cat that has really learned how to catch your woolies or whatever, and that taking that individual out will be really beneficial for your population. We know that quite a lot of native mammals can survive with a limited level of cat predation, and then you put one fox into that fenced area and bam, they're gone. So I don't have a number for you, I'm sorry. Derek's talk this morning where they're talking about the number of detections on the cameras and those animals are surviving, that's proof of the pudding. But how that translates to different landscapes and different contexts, so that we have to trial and see.
I don't have any specific numbers either, but the notion that things change dramatically when you get a fox, if anyone's ever kept chickens, you'll be aware that when a fox scratches the chicken coop, it kills all the chickens, and it may eat one. They do the same thing in the wild. We had a fox invasion at a sanctuary and it killed, I think, close to 10 quolls, all in one area. So it's, again, don't have numbers for you, but same sanctuary, if it has when it was breached by that fox, did not impact the eastern part bandicoot population because the population of EDVs was in the thousands. So there is a point somewhere, and this morning's speaker brought that up. I was really impressed that they were maintaining native animal populations in the presence of cats and foxes because they've acknowledged that they can't get them out of the landscape. There's more of a fundamental answer, which is very generalist, and I'm sure I'm not teaching you anything new, is that we do need the apex predator to keep the herd healthy, to keep the sick, the genetically compromised individuals out of the herd. So there's definitely space for predators in there somewhere.
So my question would be is the media perception of these predators, is that changing, or do you feel that there's like an inherent bias towards these predators?
That's a problem.
Bias towards the native predators or the introduced?
Probably more negative.
So the media narratives around our native predators and some of the negative, I guess, connotations, is that changing? Yeah, and how you guys see that?
I'm not the one to answer because I've removed myself from the media. But I think generally the reaction that we get when we show and talk about quolls is very positive from the public. So I think that it would not be a hard sell to say, yes, these are predators, but they're natives and they work well within the Australian ecosystem. They belong here, they've been here forever. There's definitely a space for them. And then talk about how the fox killed all the chickens. So I don't know, that's probably the best answer I have.
Yeah, I don't know, Kelly, if you have anything to add around dingoes, if you're noticing any shift in the public sentiment over the years, or?
Well, I think as we're having more and more conversation and discussions, and our voices, First Nation voices, are more in that realm, and we're able to, convey our cultural connection. I feel that people are listening more. I think they're listening because now we are showing and talking about the cultural connection, not just the ecological benefit of having dingo back onto country, but a deeper meaning to that. And I feel, although it's an uphill battle and yes, it's a struggle, there are some people out there that are interested and want to learn more and want to walk with us on that. So I must say I'm very hopeful that we can reach out more and people will come in more and journey with us in that realm.
Great. We've got one more question.
Just a quick story about dingoes. So Mount Ethel has 2 dingoes. The female Chili is our best fox hunter. If we have a fox breach or we need to find a fox, Chili is the one who will find it. She will preferentially seek out the foxes on the property above any other species. She'll ignore the rabbits, she'll ignore the bandicoots and find the fox. This, don't ask me for the paper, but this fits with some research I've heard about where there's dingo in the landscape, the fox and cat density is lower. I don't know if that's true, but it's something that I'm hearing.
It's the scanning. It's like they have this innate ability to scan country and know exactly where they need to do their work. So that's what makes them so amazing.
But they like having their butt scratched, just like a normal dog.
All right, last question, then lunchtime.
Thanks so much. About mammalian predators, but I just wondered if you could give us your perspective, please, on avian predators, specifically the Indian miners. I've noticed, particularly in Kyneton, where I have very small bird populations, even though I don't have yet much bushy habitat for them. But the miners keep on multiplying, and I was wondering whether I've got already minor trap, etc., and starting to try to do that, but is there an appetite in Melbourne and Central Victoria for doing a program like Canberra has done, where 6 trapping program and up into tens of thousands of birds have been taken out of the equation?
Any thoughts on that?
So Indian miners are...
Yeah. Thoughts on sort of bigger, government or council-led efforts, basically.
No. Sorry, I don't, but we will definitely discourage noisy miners if we find them on properties. In terms of government-led programs, I'm not aware of any, I'm afraid, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. We're all mammal people, sorry.
Well, thank you so much.